The hum of the highway was a lullaby for truckers, a monotonous drone that often blurred time and distance. For Joe, it was just another night hauling cargo across the vast emptiness of the Midwest. He had been on the road for hours, his cab filled with the faint scent of stale coffee and fast food wrappers. The radio offered static, save for a distant country station, but he didn't mind. The quiet was his companion. The road stretched endlessly before him, illuminated only by the beams of his headlights. Trees lined the highway, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The occasional deer darted across the road, but otherwise the night was eerily still. Joe glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 2:37 a.m. His next stop was still a couple of hours away, but the heaviness in his eyelids told him he wouldn't make it without a quick break. Up ahead, a faded sign announced a rest area. Joe decided it was better to pull over and catch a quick nap rather than risk dozing off behind the wheel. As he approached, the rest stop came into view, a small, deserted lot with a single flickering streetlight. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time, the kind of place that felt wrong even when nothing was overtly amiss. Joe parked his rig and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. He leaned back in his seat, adjusted his cap, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't restful. He was jolted awake by a loud thud. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding as he tried to orient himself. The cab was dark, except for the dim glow of his dashboard lights. For a moment he thought it was just a dream, but then he heard it again, a distinct, deliberate knock coming from the rear of his truck. Probably a raccoon, he muttered, though his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab. The cold air bit at his skin as he circled to the back of the truck. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air, and the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade. "Hey! Hey!" he called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "If someone's messing around, you better knock it off!" There was no response, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Joe shined his light along the length of the trailer, finding nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint sound, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Help me." Joe froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down his spine. He turned toward the trailer again, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he demanded. "Are you hurt?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me. Please." It was coming from inside the trailer. Joe's stomach twisted. He knew the trailer had been locked and sealed at the depot, but the voice sounded so desperate, so human. Against his better judgment, he climbed onto the back of the truck and inspected the lock. It was intact, just as he had left it. "Hang on. I'm getting help," he called out, but the voice responded with a panicked urgency. "No, don't leave me. Please, they'll come back." Joe hesitated. Something about this didn't add up, but the sheer terror in the voice made it impossible for him to walk away. He pulled a crowbar from his toolkit and pried the lock open. The door creaked as it swung upward, revealing the dark interior of the trailer. It was empty. Joe shined his flashlight inside, his pulse racing. The trailer was completely barren, save for a few empty pallets. He climbed inside, the metal floor creaking beneath his boots. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "Help me." The whisper came again, this time directly behind him. Joe spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The air in the trailer seemed to grow colder, and an oppressive sense of dread washed over him. He backed toward the door, his instincts screaming at him to leave. Then he saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the walls of the trailer, sent as if someone or something had been clawing to get out. The prints were dark, almost black, and glistened faintly in the beam of his flashlight. Joe's breath caught in his throat as he realized they weren't just handprints. They were accompanied by scratch marks, deep grooves etched into the metal walls. The door slammed shut behind him. Joe screamed, pounding on the door as darkness enveloped him. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in pitch black. The whispering returned, no longer faint but a cacophony of voices, each more anguished than the last. "They're here! They're here! They're here!" Joe fumbled for his phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen remained blank, unresponsive. The voices grew louder, surrounding him, pressing against him until it felt like the very air was suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The door creaked open, flooding the trailer with pale light. Joe stumbled out, gasping for air. The lot was still empty, the street lights still flickering. He climbed back into his cab, locked the doors, and sped out of the rest stop without looking back. When he reached the next town, Joe reported the incident to the local authorities. They inspected the trailer but found no evidence of anything unusual. No handprints, no scratches, nothing. The officer who took his statement gave him a strange look. "You're not the first trucker to report something like this at that rest stop," the officer said. "Place has a reputation. They say it was built on the site of an old settlement. Whole town disappeared back in the 1800s. No one knows what happened to them, but folks around here say their spirits still linger." Joe never drove that route again, but on quiet nights, when the highway stretched endlessly before him, he could still hear the whispers.
Story number 2.
Joe had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never experienced anything he couldn't explain. Flat tires, engine trouble, bad weather, those were the typical hazards of the job. But as he drove through the dense fog that blanketed Highway 491, a road locals ominously called the Devil's Highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might be different. It had started innocently enough, a late-night run hauling supplies to a remote town in New Mexico. The route was desolate, a straight stretch of road flanked scrubby desert and jagged cliffs. The GPS had warned of limited services for the next 60 miles, but Joe wasn't concerned. His tank was full and his thermos was loaded with enough coffee to keep him sharp until dawn. Then the fog rolled in. It was sudden and unnatural, like someone had dropped a thick gray curtain over the world. Joe slowed the rig to a cautious crawl, his headlights struggling to penetrate the haze. Shapes seemed to move in the periphery of his vision, darting in and out of the fog, but when he turned his head, there was nothing there. Just the oppressive grayness swallowing the road. The radio crackled with static, then cut out entirely. Joe cursed under his breath and fumbled with the dial, but all he got was the hiss of dead air. The uneasy silence settled in, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional creak of the trailer. That's when he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. Joe slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck came to a shuddering halt, and the figure remained still, illuminated by the dim glow of his headlights. It was a woman. At least, that's what Joe thought at first. She was tall and impossibly thin, her limbs unnaturally long, her pale face partially obscured by a curtain of dark, stringy hair. She wore a tattered white dress that fluttered in an invisible breeze. Joe's heart pounded as he rolled down his window a crack. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. Joe felt a chill creep down his spine. There was something off about her, something that made his instincts scream at him to drive away. But he couldn't just leave her there in the middle of nowhere. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air outside was colder than it should have been, biting through his jacket. The woman hadn't budged. Her head hung at an odd angle, and as Joe approached, he realized her feet weren't touching the ground. "Jesus," he muttered, stumbling back. The woman's head snapped up, her face now fully visible. Her eyes were black voids, bottomless and staring straight into Joe's soul. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, too wide for her face, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. Joe bolted for the cab, his boots skidding on the asphalt. He threw himself into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it in one fluid motion. The woman, or whatever she was, wasn't outside anymore. She was sitting in the passenger seat. Joe's scream caught in his throat as she turned to face him, her head tilting in that unnatural way. "Drive," she hissed, her voice a guttural rasp that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Terrified, Joe obeyed. He slammed the truck into gear and tore down the highway, the rig shaking as it picked up speed. The fog thickened, wrapping around the truck like a living thing. Joe could barely see the road, but he didn't dare stop. The woman didn't move. She just stared at him with those empty eyes, her grin stretching wider and wider. "Where do you want me to go?" Joe finally managed to choke out. "Home," she whispered. "What does that mean? Where's home?" She didn't answer. Instead, she began to hum, a haunting melody that sent chills through Joe's entire body. The fog outside seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her tune, and the truck's headlights began to flicker. Joe's grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't know what you are, but you need to get out of my truck," he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The woman let out a laugh, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that echoed inside the cab. "You brought me here," she said. "You can't take me back." The truck suddenly lurched as if it had hit something, but there was nothing on the road. The lights died, plunging the cab into darkness. Joe slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. It barreled forward, the engine roaring louder and louder until it was deafening. Then everything went silent. Joe woke up slumped over the steering wheel, the morning sun streaming through the windshield. The truck was parked on the side of the road, its engine off. He looked around, dazed and disoriented, but there was no sign of the woman. He stepped out of the cab, his legs shaky, and noticed something strange. The road behind him was gone. In its place was an expanse of cracked earth, littered with bones and charred remnants of what looked like wagons. Joe's eyes widened as he realized where he was standing. At the edge of a ghost town he'd only heard about in legends. The locals called it the Lost Settlement, a place where travelers vanished without a trace. Joe didn't wait to learn more. He climbed back into his truck, turned the ignition, and drove as fast as he could. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, where he parked at a diner and sat shaking over a cup of coffee. He never drove that route again. But every now and then, when the fog rolled in, he swore he could hear her humming that same haunting melody, calling him back to the road that never ended.
Story number 3.
Dan had always thought of himself as the unshakable type. 20 years behind the wheel of his big rig had taught him patience, focus, and a knack for ignoring the kinds of strange things you sometimes see late at night on desolate highways. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the nightmare he encountered on a stretch of rural highway known as Route 13. He'd picked up the load, a refrigerated trailer of produce in Montana, and was heading south to Utah. The route wasn't particularly scenic, but it cut through a remote stretch of prairie where the road felt endless, with no gas stations, rest stops, or signs of life for miles. It was just past midnight when Dan noticed the first oddity. A pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as they grew closer, he realized the vehicle wasn't behaving normally. The lights swerved erratically, zigzagging between lanes, before suddenly speeding up to ride his bumper. Dan's hand tightened on the wheel. "Drunk driver," he muttered under his breath. He tapped his brakes slightly, hoping to signal the car to back off, but the vehicle didn't respond. Instead, the headlights blinked out completely. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced in the mirror again. Nothing. No lights. No car. Just the pitch-black road stretching behind him. Dan took a deep breath. Maybe they'd turned off onto a side road he hadn't noticed. Or maybe his sleep-deprived brain was playing tricks on him. 15 minutes passed and he began to relax. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights reappeared, this time directly in front of him. Dan's breath caught in his throat. The vehicle was barreling straight toward him, blindingly bright and impossibly fast. He slammed the horn and swerved onto the shoulder, the truck shuddering as its tires kicked up gravel. But there was no collision, no sound of screeching brakes or crunching metal. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the car was gone again. Dan pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped out of the cab and scanned the empty road. The air was eerily still, the only sound the faint hum of his truck's engine. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, climbing back into the cab. But as he settled into his seat, he noticed something chilling, a handprint smeared in condensation on the inside of his windshield. It hadn't been there before. The print was huge, almost inhumanly so, with long, spindly fingers that ended in sharp points. Dan's stomach churned. He wiped the glass clean, trying to convince himself it was just some trick of the light. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was out there. The road stretched on, and for a while, nothing happened. But as he approached a narrow bridge spanning a dry creek bed, he felt a sudden, bone-deep chill. The headlights flickered and died, plunging the truck into darkness. Dan cursed and flipped the switch, but the lights wouldn't come back on. The cab's interior glowed faintly from the dashboard, casting eerie shadows. He slowed the truck to a crawl, his pulse quickening. That's when he saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the bridge, illuminated by the weak glow of the dash lights. She was gaunt, with matted hair hanging over her face and a filthy dress that clung to her skeletal frame. her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she raised one hand and pointed directly at him. Dan slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. He sat frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from her. She moved. It wasn't walking exactly, more like gliding, her feet barely touching the ground. She drifted closer, her face still obscured by her hair. Dan fumbled for his radio, but it was dead. The only sound was the faint creak of her movements as she approached the driver's side door. The cab rocked violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. Dan turned to look and immediately regretted it. The woman's face was pressed against the window, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes black pits. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, broken teeth. She raised her hand and raked her nails across the glass, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Dan threw the truck into gear and floored it, the trailer lurching behind him as the rig roared down the highway. He didn't look back. It wasn't until he reached the safety of a truck stop an hour later that he dared to stop. Shaking, he climbed out and inspected the cab. The glass on the driver's side window was splintered, long, deep scratches marring the surface. He walked to the front of the truck and stopped cold. Smeared across the grill was a dark, sticky substance that reeked of rot. He wiped it with a rag, but the stench lingered. Dan never took that route again. But every now and then, on foggy nights, truckers passing through Route 13 report strange sightings. A pair of erratic headlights, a gaunt figure standing at the edge of the bridge, and the haunting sound of nails dragging across glass. Some say it's just a ghost story, a tale meant to scare new drivers. But Dan knows better. He still wakes up some nights to the sound of scratching, and when he does, he swears he can smell that same rotting stench.
Story number 4.
The open road had always been a sanctuary for Brent. As a long-haul trucker, he thrived in the solitude, with only the hum of the engine and the vast expanse of America keeping him company. But on one particular night, somewhere along a desolate stretch of Highway 9, Brent would come to regret every mile he'd ever driven. It was nearing 2 a.m. when his CB radio crackled to life, a faint and static-filled voice breaking the monotony of the quiet night. "Help anyone, please." Brent grabbed the receiver, glancing at his dashboard clock. He hadn't passed another vehicle in hours, and no one had responded to the distress call. "This is Brent, coming south on Highway 9, he said, his voice steady. "What's your location?" Silence. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity, "They're coming." The voice was a whisper now, barely audible above the static, and it sent an icy shiver down Brent's spine. "Who's coming?" he asked, gripping the receiver tightly. Do you need assistance?" The response was a guttural, inhuman sound, a mixture of static and a growl, like the howl of a distorted animal. The CB radio went dead. Brent's hands tightened on the wheel. He tried to shake it off. Weird signals weren't uncommon in rural areas. Maybe some kids were playing a prank. He turned the radio dial, searching for another frequency, but all he got was static. Up ahead, his headlights illuminated something lying in the road. As he drew closer, his stomach twisted. It was a car, flipped onto its side, its windshield shattered and the roof caved in. Steam hissed from the engine, and the driver's door hung open. Brent slowed his rig and pulled onto the shoulder. His training kicked in. An accident this far out meant the victim might not have help for hours. Grabbing his flashlight, he climbed down from the cab and approached the wreck cautiously. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The interior of the car was dark, the seats empty. He shone the flashlight into the surrounding brush, searching for any sign of a driver. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling, like leaves shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was unnaturally still. Brent turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. "Hello? Is someone there?" The rustling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Brent's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw something, a figure, hunched and unnatural, darting between the trees. He backed toward his truck, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But before he could reach the cab, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening. Brent froze, his breath catching in his throat. Then from the shadows a voice. "They're coming." It was the same voice from the CB radio, but this time it was clear, unmistakably human, and it was coming from behind him. Brent spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. There was no one there, just the wrecked car glinting in the moonlight. A low growl broke the silence, deep and guttural, and Brent turned back toward the trees. His beam of light landed on something that made his blood run cold. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, reflecting the flashlight's beam. They were too high off the ground to be animals, too close together to be human, and they were moving toward him. Brent didn't wait to see what they belonged to. He bolted for the truck, his boots pounding against the asphalt. He threw himself into the cab and locked the doors, his heart racing. The eyes were closer now, and he could make out the shapes of the things they belonged to. Elongated figures, their limbs impossibly long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Brent slammed the rig into gear and floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, tires screeching as it tore down the highway. In his mirrors, he could see the creatures giving chase, their distorted forms illuminated by the trailer's taillights. But they didn't slow down. Brent pushed the truck to its limits, the engine whining in protest. The creatures fell further behind, but they didn't stop running. Even when they were little more than shadows on the horizon, he could still see the faint glow of their eyes. He didn't stop until he reached a truck stop miles away, his hands trembling as he parked the rig. Brent never drove Highway 9 again, and he never figured out what those things were or why they'd been waiting in the dark. But sometimes, when he was driving late at night on another lonely road, his CB radio would crackle with faint static, and he'd hear that same whisper, "They're coming."
Story number 5.
Jeff had been hauling freight across the country for nearly a decade. He liked the solitude of the open road and the freedom it gave him, but every trucker knows that certain stretches of highway have a reputation. One of them was State Route 47, a lonely, desolate road that cut through miles of uninhabited wilderness. Locals called it Dead Man's Mile, and Jeff always dismissed the stories as nothing more than urban legends. That was until one stormy night when Jeff found himself on that very stretch of road, and the legends became terrifyingly real. The rain was relentless, hammering against his windshield and sheets, his wipers barely keeping up. The highway was deserted, nothing but darkness ahead and behind him. The faint glow of his headlights revealed towering trees on either side of the road, their branches swaying wildly in the wind. Jeff squinted into the rain and slowed his rig. Up ahead, he thought he saw a figure standing on the shoulder. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman, drenched and shivering, waving her arms desperately for him to stop. Pulling over, Jeff rolled down his window slightly, rain blowing into the cab. "Ma'am, you okay?" he called out. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "You have to help me. My car broke down. There's something out here. Something's been following me." Jeff hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers was a rule he rarely broke, but the look of sheer terror on her face made him reconsider. "All right, get in," he said, unlocking the passenger door. She scrambled into the cab, her clothes soaked and her hair plastered to her face. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the seatbelt. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what's out there. What's going on?" Jeff asked, pulling back onto the highway. "You see a bear or something?" She shook her head violently. "It's not an animal. It's like a man, but not. It's been chasing me ever since my car broke down. I thought I lost it, but..." Her voice trailed off as her eyes darted toward the side mirror. Jeff glanced at it instinctively, but saw only darkness. "You sure you're not just spooked?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. She didn't answer, just stared out the window, her face pale. Minutes passed in silence, the rain drumming against the cab. Jeff kept one eye on the road and the other on the mirrors, half expecting to see something lurching out of the shadows. Then it happened. A loud bang echoed through the cab, as if something had struck the side of the trailer. Jeff's hands tightened on the wheel as the woman screamed. "What the hell was that?" Jeff growled, glancing at his side mirror. The mirror showed nothing but rain-soaked blackness. "It's here," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Jeff gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to let some animal or prankster damage his rig. He pulled off onto the shoulder and grabbed the flashlight from his glove box. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping out into the storm. The rain was ice cold, soaking through his jacket in seconds. He walked along the side of the trailer, shining the flashlight over the wet metal. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just streaks of rainwater. But then he noticed deep claw marks gouged into the side of the trailer, as if something with enormous talons had raked across it. Jeff's pulse quickened. He swung the flashlight toward the back of the trailer, the beam cutting through the rain. That's when he saw it. A figure was crouched just behind the trailer's rear axle, its body unnaturally thin and twisted. Its skin was gray, almost translucent, and its limbs were impossibly long. The thing's head turned slowly, and Jeff caught a glimpse of its eyes, black pits gleaming with malevolent hunger. Jeff stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The creature let out a low, guttural growl and began to move toward him, its movements jerky and inhuman. He bolted for the cab, his boots slipping on the wet asphalt. Throwing himself into the driver's seat, he slammed the door shut and locked it. "Drive!" the woman screamed. Jeff didn't need to be told twice. He floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward. In the mirrors, he saw the creature give chase, its gangly limbs propelling it faster than any human could run. "What the hell is that thing?" Jeff shouted, his knuckles white on the wheel. "I told you," the woman cried. "It's been following me since I broke down. It doesn't stop. It never stops." The truck barreled down the highway, the trailer swaying as Jeff pushed the rig to its limits. The creature kept pace for a terrifyingly long time, its silhouette illuminated by the truck's taillights. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped and vanished into the darkness. Jeff didn't stop driving until he reached the next town. He pulled into a well-lit truck stop and turned to the woman, his hands still trembling. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door locked, and there wasn't a single drop of water on the upholstery. Jeff stared in disbelief, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? As he stepped out of the cab, he noticed something on the side of the trailer. Carved into the metal, deep and jagged, were 3 words: "It follows forever." The road is lonely, but sometimes it's better to be alone.
Story number 6.
Cole was used to the long, quiet nights on the road. As a long-haul trucker, the solitude was part of the job, and he even found a strange kind of peace in it. But one night, on a remote desert highway, peace turned to terror. It was well past midnight, and Cole's rig was the only vehicle on the road. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, a black void interrupted only by the faint glint of stars above. His headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and occasional tufts of dry grass. The CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, you got ears on, driver?" Cole frowned. The voice was low and garbled, almost like a growl. He hesitated before responding. "This is Big Red. I copy," he replied, his voice steady. Silence. Then, "Don't stop for her. Whatever you do, don't stop for her." The radio went dead. Cole stared at it, a chill creeping up his spine. He'd heard his share of pranks over the radio, but something about the voice felt wrong. He shook it off and kept driving. But as he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a figure up ahead, standing on the side of the road. It was a woman. She was barefoot, her long dress tattered and swaying in the desert wind. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes glinted as they caught the light. She raised a hand, waving slowly. Cole's first instinct was to pull over. Whoever she was, she clearly needed help. But the voice from the CB radio echoed in his mind, "Don't stop for her." He slowed the truck, but didn't stop, keeping his eyes on the road. As he passed her, he caught a glimpse of her face. Her expression was blank, but her eyes, they followed him. Cole's heart pounded as he drove on, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But then the CB radio crackled again. "You saw her, didn't you?" Cole grabbed the mic. "Who is this? What the hell's going on?" "She's coming," the voice rasped. "She always does." Before Cole could respond, the radio went silent. He felt a cold sweat on his brow, his grip tightening on the wheel. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic thump coming from the trailer. He glanced at his mirrors but saw nothing unusual. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get in. "Damn it," Cole muttered. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder and grabbed his flashlight. Stepping out into the night, he shivered despite the desert heat. The silence was oppressive, the kind that pressed on your ears and made you feel utterly alone. Walking to the back of the trailer, he shone his flashlight over the metal doors. They were undamaged, no sign of anyone tampering with them. Thump, thump! The sound came again, this time from above. Cole froze, his breath hitching. Slowly, he tilted the flashlight upward, the beam climbing the side of the trailer until it illuminated the roof. She was there. The woman from the roadside was perched on top of the trailer, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Her eyes locked onto his, and she let out a guttural laugh that echoed through the desert. Cole stumbled back, his flashlight falling to the ground. He bolted for the cab, his boots slipping on the gravel. As he climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut, he heard her voice, soft, almost playful. "Let me in, driver." He floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as the rig lurched forward. The laughter followed him, growing louder, more frenzied. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her clinging to the side of the trailer, her body contorting as she crawled toward the cab. Cole's hands shook as he reached for the CB mic. "Whoever you are, I need help. She's on the truck." The radio crackled. "Don't stop. She can't hold on forever." The laughter grew faint as Cole pushed the truck to its limits, the speedometer needle climbing. Eventually, the noise stopped, replaced by the steady roar of the engine and his own ragged breathing. He drove until dawn, unwilling to stop until he reached a crowded truck stop. When he finally pulled in and inspected the rig, his heart sank. Deep scratches gouged the sides of the trailer, and the back doors were covered in bloody handprints. Cole never drove that stretch of highway again, but the nightmares stayed with him. And sometimes late at night, when the road was empty, he swore he could hear her laughter in the static of the CB radio. The open road hides many things, but some are better left undiscovered.
Story number 7.
The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. Jake adjusted his wipers to their highest setting, but it didn't help much. The storm had turned the rural highway into a blurry nightmare, and he was hours away from the next truck stop. Jake wasn't new to long-haul trucking, but tonight the oppressive darkness and the howling wind had him on edge. The radio had died hours ago, and his phone had no signal. It was just him, the storm, and the road. He almost didn't see it. A flash of white on the shoulder of the road, illuminated briefly by his headlights. He hit the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop. Squinting through the rain, Jake saw a figure stumbling toward him. A man, drenched and limping, his clothes torn and muddy. Jake hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, but he couldn't just leave someone out here in this weather. Rolling down the window slightly, he called out, "Hey, you okay?" The man staggered closer, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide, darting nervously over his shoulder. "Please," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You have to get me out of here." Jake opened the passenger door, and the man climbed in, water pooling on the seat beneath him. He slammed the door shut and leaned back, trembling. "Thanks," the man whispered, his voice shaking. "They were chasing me." Jake frowned. "Who's chasing you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stared out the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. His hands were clenched into fists, his nails dirty and broken. "Look," Jake began. "I can take you to the next town, but—" "Don't stop," the man interrupted, his voice sharp. "No matter what, don't stop." Jake's unease deepened. He glanced at the man again, noting the strange marks on his neck, deep, jagged scratches as if he'd been attacked by an animal. "What happened to you?" Jake asked. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window, his breathing shallow. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed the accelerator. The rain seemed to grow heavier, the darkness thicker. And then he saw them. Figures on the side of the road, barely visible through the sheets of rain. They were thin, almost skeletal, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. As the truck passed, their heads snapped toward the vehicle, their hollow eyes glinting in the headlights. Jake's heart raced. "What the hell was that?" "They found me?" the man whispered. Suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof of the cab. Jake swerved, trying to keep the truck on the road. "Don't stop!" the man yelled, his voice frantic. The thudding continued, heavy footsteps moving across the roof. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. One of the figures was running alongside the truck, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it kept pace. The thing turned its head, grinning at him, with a mouth full of sharp, broken teeth. Jake slammed the accelerator, the truck roaring as it barreled down the highway. The footsteps on the roof grew faster, more insistent, as if whatever was up there was trying to break through. The man in the passenger seat began to chant under his breath, a low, guttural sound that made Jake's skin crawl. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded. "They can't take me back," the man muttered. "I won't go back." The windshield cracked suddenly, a long, jagged line splintering across the glass. A pale, clawed hand slammed against it, leaving behind streaks of black, tar-like substance. Jake screamed, swerving wildly. The truck hit a bump, and the figure on the roof was thrown off. But the others were still following, their emaciated bodies moving faster than any human should. The chanting grew louder, more frantic. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, his voice echoing strangely in the cab. "What the hell are you doing?" Jake yelled. The man didn't answer. His body convulsed, his mouth stretching open impossibly wide as he let out an inhuman screech. The figures outside stopped, their heads snapping toward the cab. They crouched low, their movements predatory, before retreating into the darkness. The man collapsed, his body limp. Jake pulled over, his hands shaking as he reached for the man's shoulder. "Hey," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The man's eyes snapped open, black and empty. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. The cab filled with a deafening roar as the figures descended, their clawed hands smashing through the windows, their jagged teeth closing in. They say Jake's truck was found abandoned on the side of the highway, the cab covered in deep scratches and black handprints. But Jake and his passenger were never seen again.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm was merciless. Heavy flakes swirled like a white curtain, obscuring visibility as Danny navigated his 18-wheeler down the lonely mountain road. It was supposed to be a routine delivery, but the unexpected blizzard had turned it into a fight for survival. The CB radio crackled occasionally, but the other truckers had grown silent, each likely grappling with the storm in their own vehicles. The road stretched endlessly ahead, its edges swallowed by the encroaching snowbanks. Danny squinted into the swirling snow, his headlights barely cutting through the storm. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. The figure was tall and unmoving, draped in what looked like a long, dark coat. As the snow whipped around them, Danny's stomach tightened. Something about the silhouette felt wrong. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the cab door, the icy wind cutting through his jacket like knives. "Hey!" Danny shouted. "You okay?" The figure didn't respond. It stood completely still, its face obscured by the storm. Danny hesitated. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to get back in the truck, but his sense of duty as a trucker, the unwritten code to help those in need, overruled his instincts. He stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "Do you need help?" The figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement that sent a chill down Danny's spine. And then it smiled. The lips stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and black, like shards of obsidian. Danny stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure moved then, but not like a person. It glided over the snow, its long limbs bending at grotesque angles as it advanced toward him. Danny bolted back to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled to put the truck in gear. The figure was at the driver's side window now, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pull at Danny's soul. The smile widened, the black teeth tapping against the window like claws. Danny floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, tires spinning before catching traction. The figure didn't move out of the way, it simply vanished, dissolving into the swirling snow. But the nightmare wasn't over. A loud thud came from the trailer. Danny's heart pounded as he checked his mirrors. There was nothing there, just the endless expanse of white. The thudding grew louder, accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. "Get off my truck!" Danny shouted, his voice trembling. The CB radio crackled, startling him. "Breaker 19, a voice said, low and distorted. "You can't escape it. Turn back. Who is this?" Danny demanded, his eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. Silence. And then the voice returned, almost a whisper. "It's already inside." Danny's blood ran cold. Slowly, he glanced at the passenger seat. The figure was sitting there, its body contorted to fit in the confined space. Its smile was wider now, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Danny screamed, jerking the wheel. The truck swerved wildly, the trailer jackknifing as it skidded off the road. The last thing Danny saw before everything went black was the figure's gaping maw, its teeth closing in. When the storm cleared the next morning, rescue crews found Danny's truck overturned in a snowbank. The cab was empty, the doors still locked from the inside. The only sign of him was a set of footprints leading into the woods. Footprints that stopped abruptly in the middle of the snow, as if he'd been lifted into the sky. Truckers passing through the mountain road still talk about Danny's fate. Some say the figure is a spirit of the lost, luring its victims into the storm. Others swear they've seen it themselves, standing in the road, smiling, waiting. They say if you ever spot it, don't stop, no matter how human it seems.
Story number 9.
The highway stretched endlessly through the desert, the moon casting a pale glow over the barren landscape. Alex had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine the only sound to keep him company. He was hauling a load of construction materials to a remote site, but this stretch of road was isolated, desolate, and far removed from the usual routes. It was the kind of silence that made your own thoughts loud, and tonight Alex wished for any distraction. His CB radio was eerily quiet, and his cell phone had lost service miles ago. As the truck rumbled onward, Alex caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror. A pair of headlights, faint but unmistakable. He frowned. There hadn't been another vehicle on this road for hours. The lights grew closer, their glow unsettlingly dim. Alex glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't going slow, yet the vehicle behind him seemed to be gaining effortlessly. When the headlights finally pulled up alongside him, Alex turned to look. It wasn't a car or a truck. It was an old, rusted hearse, its black paint peeling and its windows tinted so dark they seemed opaque. Alex felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Who drives a hearse out here in the middle of nowhere? The hearse kept pace with him for several miles, its engine a low growl that he could hear even over his own truck. Then, without warning, it veered sharply in front of him, cutting him off. Alex slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching as it skidded to a halt. The hearse stopped just ahead, idling in the middle of the road. For a long moment, neither vehicle moved. Alex's heart thudded in his chest as he stared at the hearse. Its taillights glowed like sinister eyes, and the longer he looked, the more it felt like the vehicle was watching him. Then, the hearse's back door creaked open. Alex's breath caught in his throat as a figure climbed out. It was tall and gaunt, its frame draped in tattered black robes. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but Alex could feel its gaze piercing through the windshield. The figure raised an arm, bony and unnaturally long, and pointed directly at him. "Hell no," Alex muttered, shifting the truck into reverse. As he began backing away, the hearse's engine roared to life, and the figure vanished. The vehicle spun around with impossible speed, its headlights blazing as it charged straight at him. Alex floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward as he tried to outrun the hearse. The massive vehicle strained under the effort, but the hearse was relentless, closing the gap with unnatural ease. The CB radio crackled to life, a voice hissing through the static. "You can't run, Alex?" His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Who the hell is this?" he shouted, but there was no response, just static and faint, distorted laughter. The hearse was inches away now, its grille nearly kissing the back of the trailer. Alex could see its driver through the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure with hollow, glowing eyes and a grin that stretched too wide for any human face. Suddenly, the truck's lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no!" Alex yelled, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The hearse rammed the back of the trailer, the impact jolting the entire truck. Alex fought to keep control as the truck swerved wildly, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hearse vanished. The road ahead was empty, the desert silent once more. Alex pulled over, his heart racing and his hands trembling. He stepped out of the cab, scanning the darkness for any sign of the hearse. There was nothing. No lights, no sound, not even tire tracks in the dirt. He was alone. Breathing heavily, Alex climbed back into the truck, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever that was. But as he reached for the gear shift, he froze. In the passenger seat sat a small black coffin, its lid slightly ajar. A cold skeletal hand emerged from within, followed by a voice that whispered, "You should have kept driving." They found Alex's truck the next morning, abandoned on the highway. The trailer was intact, the engine still running, but Alex was gone. All that remained was a trail of footprints leading into the desert, and a single black feather resting on the dashboard.